Welcome to Chapter 1 of Listening to Jazz. On page 3, you will see an overview. Give you a second to read that. As you read this, I want you to pay attention to these concepts, how this particular music, jazz, is indigenous, it's democratic, it's improvised. It's made up of equal partners and all types of musical expression. The leadership of who's leading the group shifts. There's a balance between both individual and collective expression, and each ensemble is unique. Early on, any music not classical was called jazz. That included genres that are clearly not jazz, like country western and pop and folk music. And now the distinction between good and bad jazz has settled, but it wasn't without a controversy. America's music, jazz, has many faces. Most have very temporary popularity. Americans' music in general. But jazz is the one genre that's become woven in America's identity, and it's the first American genre to claim that. Jazz has gone from not being very highly regarded to becoming an appropriate subject for university study. It's now embedded deeply in our American culture. In the beginning, it was merely the music of enslaved people. And then it started showing up other places, such as church and in the dance halls. And eventually, over decades, it made it to the academy and eventually to the concert stage as a legitimate art form. The other type that's probably poised to become that is rock and roll, may eventually become its own identity within the American culture and have staying power. It's challenging to follow jazz's transformation. Only in the United States could these diverse influences coalesce into one form, and that's the rich oral tradition of the enslaved people from Africa. It's those people with a Western European background who had formal schooling and knew how to read and write music, and it showed up as an urban form of music, as a rural form of music. It showed up in the black church, in the white church, in Tin Pan Alley, in the Roaring Twenties, in the marching bands, jug bands, blues, and the religious fervor of the Great Awakening. So all of those influences, good, the bad, and the ugly, had a hand in creating jazz. On page 4, you'll study the historical frame of reference for jazz. In particular, in there, I want you to note that it's very difficult to go back and look at that because recording capabilities were so limited, and oftentimes what was going on, we're missing the cultural context of that. Since jazz was somewhat of an oral tradition, it's hard to describe, even if you try to write it down in a European classical system. A lot of early jazz was patterned on the singing style of the time, and from the oral tradition, that really defies notation, because some things that the voice can do simply we don't have symbols for as you write. A lot of the written descriptions of jazz at that time are just insufficient, but we must strive to look at what was going on culturally with that, within when that jazz was formed. On page 4 and 5, you'll come across understanding jazz, and it cannot be done without understanding the performers. Its development is actually traced through individual players, those whose musical expression stood out above others, who were accomplished technically and contributed aesthetically to the form. The categories of jazz cannot be forced rigidly into styles, but there were players who played similarly within an era, and those broad classifications are very useful. individuals actually propelled jazz's evolution. Jazz is not static. I know that's obvious, but still it's a little elusive. It's hard to distinguish jazz. It's hard to distinguish what its unique characteristics are. However, it's easier to recognize jazz than it is to describe how you know that it is jazz. So it's best to look at some very technical aspects that are understood by its players. That signals even the most untrained ear. These characteristics don't have to be present in every jazz performance, but some of those is what is played is less than how it's played. So two different groups could play a line, and with one group it sounds jazzy, and with the other group it doesn't, and it's how it's played. And with jazz, you often run into improvisation or vocal and instrumental inflections that you can recognize. Sometimes there's the way the rhythmic aspect of it is delivered. For example, it might be syncopated, or it might swing, or you might be very aware of a personal player's style, how they interpret it. What do you listen to for jazz? Well, let me finish just a little bit here before we do that. Let me go back. So jazz's most distinctive attribute is how the elements and forms are performed and improvised upon. We're going to be tracing how the African Americans melted with European traditions and vice versa. So the African Americans began to use European instruments in a new way than the Europeans played those instruments. So they played it as if it were a singing line, something that would be sung, a vocal line. And oftentimes you can recognize jazz through the treatment of the melody, that it's infused with interpretive ideas of the person playing it, that it has specific tone color and dynamics and rhythmic effects, accents, slight alterations. The kicker about jazz is that it's nearly impossible to write it down in notation and capture what the player does to make it sound like jazz. Right. Moving on, what to listen for? Passive listen has very little benefit in jazz. Well, in any music really, but particularly in jazz. Concentration to detail as it unfolds is key. Remembering what you hear so you can recognize it when it's repeated. That repetition makes the structure, and that structure can tell you how it's built, how it's formed. So you begin to listen to different stylistic things, and we'll learn about those things. Form in ABA form, meaning repetition, contrast, repetition, or perhaps a boogie-woogie bass line, and we'll come across that and learn what these things are. So sounds associated with jazz, oftentimes, let you read that slide for just a second. Sounds associated with jazz are often singer sound, things like growls, bends, slurs, vibrato, sounds that the great singers utilized. Here's a slide of some of the famous jazz singers and some of the things that they just do naturally to create their style, their jazz style. Other things to listen to are for instrumental sounds. Is there a sax section? Is there a rhythm section? Are mutes being used? Can you really tell a personalized style because certain players just sound like nobody else? Instantly you can recognize Ella Fitzgerald or Frank Sinatra, for example. And you can tell that just by the way they attack notes or their vibrato, or they do certain little signature riffs. So here's a slide that's Paul Desmond, very recognizable player. Cultural influences in jazz. This combination of African and European music is going to be a theme throughout this course, and that's the Western tradition being literate, meaning you can read and write the music and other people can duplicate it exactly like it's written. and the African American tradition, which is oral, passed down from performer to performer. In the jazz idiom, idiom being a characteristic mode of expression in music or art, that idiomatic expression is the result of this coupling of that oral tradition that cannot be notated, and with European instruments, European forms. So recordings are really the best teacher for the jazz style. Important to know here is that reading music or musical literacy has always been held in very high regard, and it's always been considered somewhat superior to the oral tradition. The oral tradition has been viewed as more primitive, less value. These things, of course, are racially charged, but the perception held is that jazz is illegitimate, that it might even be dangerous. And if you'll remember back, literacy was forbidden amongst enslaved people, and anybody caught teaching a slave how to read or write was punished. It's taken a while for jazz to find its formal footing and establish its legitimacy. But today it's recognized the world over as a uniquely American art form. As you go through the cultural influences, if you read about the Creole people, they were very critical, key to the development of jazz. So note that. Let's see. Okay, looking in improvisation and composition, there's some things I'd like you to look at. And here's some other things that I want you to look at for that. For example, there's a spectrum of how improvisation works in some jazz. For example, some jazz is completely composed. Everybody plays what's written on the page. And sometimes the melody is rendered accurately, but it's given this distinctive style. Sometimes the melody is changed so much that you can barely recognize it. And sometimes you just use the chord changes of a tune and you don't even hear the melodic reference. And sometimes there's no melodic reference at all, which is a free jazz style. And the New Orleans style was one where all players improvised simultaneously at the same time and made a collective piece. And that's the kind of thing that would be very, very difficult to replicate. And it's sad that there are not many recordings of authentic early jazz of that sort. The various jazz periods lean towards, they might favor one side or the other. For example, cool third stream, jazz rock, which is fusion, or avant-garde, are all lean toward that European style where more is written out. There's more composition. The aural style is seen more in early New Orleans bop, hard bop, free, mainstream, and players like Duke Ellington were masterful balancers of those two. All right. Rhythm is a key thing to understand to get that feel of jazz. That idea that you could be just a little bit ahead of the beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, bump, bump, or slightly behind the beat, 2, 3, 4, 1, right behind the beat like that. That kind of gives it part of its feel, that anticipation and that laying back. Gunther Schuller, and I quote, says, "The most magnificent, irresistible force among all the elements is rhythm." Jazz was originally meant to dance by. In its earlier forms, a steady, unbroken beat required for dancing. And jazz players can anticipate the beat or lay back. So here you'll read about syncopation and swing, about form. Okay. And you may go back and look at this without the sound, but thought I would talk through some things. There's a great listening guide from 11 to 13. Study that and look at these links. And here I've taken that listening guide and put it into 2 tables to ease your grasp for your benefit. And then I want to direct you to these timed listening guides. Good luck.